I thought I was done with my discussions of Richard Dawkins and his book, The God Delusion. However, an interesting topic has come up, and so I'd like to revisit that issue. One recurring theme in my recent videos has been the fact that there are various tactics and ways of communication and ways of thinking that tend to obscure effective communication between believers and non-believers, and that I think we need to avoid those things. Today I'd like to talk about one such way of thinking that simply muddies the waters. Well, here's the story. In my videos on Richard Dawkins, I've talked about how there are various atheistic scholars who likewise agree that the reasoning Dawkins used was faulty. In other words, they believe there is no God, or otherwise doubt God's existence, but at the same time recognize that Dawkins went about demonstrating this in an entirely haphazard and illogical way. The point behind this was to emphasize that you don't have to believe in God to recognize that the logic Dawkins used was sloppy and that he used really bad philosophy. I've said this several times, but apparently the point is lost on some people because I keep getting people responding by saying, you have not substantiated your claim that God exists. By the way, I have several videos that do present reasons why I believe God exists, so you can't say that I'm just glossing over that topic. One of these critics of Richard Dawkins was atheistic philosopher Michael Ruse, one of the most well-known atheistic debaters of our time. Now, most people are willing to admit the possibility that Michael Ruse did indeed claim that the book, The God Delusion, made him embarrassed to be an atheist. By the way, that claim is readily verifiable on the net. But one person responded by saying, where did you get this quote? You need to establish some credibility, otherwise you are going to be a laughingstock. By the way, when people phrase their challenges in that way, it's obvious that it's not just a simple request for information, nor is it merely expressing doubt. I mean, that's pretty strong language there. That's a pretty strong claim which, how do I put it, strongly implies that you think this quote is bogus. In fact, later on I will be discussing my source for that quote, as well as other comments that Michael Ruse has made regarding the God Delusion and the sloppy thinking embodied in that book. My point is this. In the course of this discussion, I emphasize that I do have sources for this quote, and this critic responded by saying, well, I've managed to find an essay or an article where Michael Ruse said the exact opposite. He declined to state what that source was, though, nor did he give the exact wording in it. Therein lies the problem. I think that when it comes to these debates, people often employ a double standard. In this case, the onus was supposed upon me to provide a very precise quote and the source for that quote, stating that Michael Ruse thought the God Delusion was an embarrassing text. Whereas I hesitate to use the word opponent, but whereas my opponent simply was content to say that he read an article somewhere, that he managed to find an article somewhere without providing the specifics. Do you see the problem there? You cannot demand one degree of proof for one side without providing an equitable degree of proof or evidence for the other side. I fully believe in burden of proof. In fact, this opponent used that phrase. The burden of proof is on you. I agree the burden of proof is on people who make a claim. That is one reason why I do provide videos which emphasize reasons why I believe God exists. I'll talk more about burden of proof in a subsequent video, by the way. But if you're going to claim that, say, Michael Ruse said the exact opposite, that he praised the God Delusion, you also have to substantiate that claim. Certainly before resorting to harsh language and disparaging the credibility of another person or implying that that person is a laughingstock. That's mighty strong language there. Sadly, the use of this double standard comes up, or double standards like these come up a lot in debates between theists and atheists, or Christians and non-Christians. One perfect example was the set of videos I produced discussing whether religion is indeed the greatest source of killing and suffering in the world. A great many people were perfectly content to accept that claim, and basically nodding, saying, oh yes, of course religion is the greatest source of killing and suffering in the world. But when I cited actual statistics showing that the greatest murderers of all time were atheists, all of a sudden, a much higher degree of substantiation was required. All of a sudden, people asking, where did you get those numbers? I want to know where you got those numbers. And so, or how do you know that Lenin, Stalin, and company were atheists? Well, first of all, the numbers themselves are readily substantiated. The World Book Encyclopedia, for example, is one such source. And the fact that they were atheists is also well documented and evidenced by the fact that they went around killing people who worshipped God. Even if you deny they're atheists, there certainly were people who had an anti-religious agenda. That's just one example of how you can adopt one degree of burden of proof for one side and a much looser standard for the other. In another video, I talked about how in discussions of abortion, people will often say, I refuse to accept your sources because they come from a pro-life agency, while happily accepting the claims of Planned Parenthood or NARAL. Now, I don't deny that an objective source is preferable to an unobjective source, but the point there is that, first of all, bias is not automatically an invalidator of one's claims, and second, you cannot adopt inequitable standards of substantiation for both sides. If you're going to demand unbiased sources for one side, you need to provide unbiased sources for your own claims, and so forth and so on. By the way, it's not just, atheists or pro-choicers or other people who are hostile to conservative Christianity who do this sort of thing. I do see this sort of thing from Christian believers as well. It's been a long time since I've heard this sort of thing. Last time was a few years ago in a discussion on Catholicism, where one Catholic said, refused to accept claims made by a Protestant website on the grounds that it was biased, and then said, for an unbiased source, you need to go to EWTN, the Catholic cable channel. Now, that's clearly a lopsided approach to substantiation. You're saying you can't use a Protestant source, but Catholic sources need to be treated as unbiased. My goal here is not to bash Catholicism, although I certainly have some viewpoints on that matter. My goal is simply to say that you need to adopt an equitable standard of proof, regardless of whether it's a discussion between theists and atheists, Christians and non-Christians, or even different varieties of people who call themselves Christian. I'll revisit the topic later on when I produce a video discussing the nature of burden of proof. Right now I want to revisit the claim I made earlier, where I talked about how Michael Ruse did say that the God Delusion was an embarrassment to him. That quote comes from the cover of the book, The Dawkins Delusion, where the authors were named McGrath, and Michael Ruse specifically said, the God Delusion makes me embarrassed to be an atheist, and the McGraths show why. In other words, it was in the context of his endorsing a book that exposed why Dawkins used faulty reasoning and sloppy philosophy, and for that matter, a sloppy sense of history. Now, some would say, in fact, one person did say, that's on the cover of a book. That doesn't count. That's not good enough. Why not? The question is whether Michael Ruse said such a thing or not. Now, in the fact he did say so, the fact that it was on the cover of a book, of an anti-Dawkins book, is simply irrelevant. He said those words. In fact, he said so in a very public way, and in a way that's readily verifiable. Was there any outcry on the part of Michael Ruse saying, I never said those words? Absolutely not. In fact, if that doesn't convince you, I also cited, in my discussion with this fella, the comments that Michael Ruse made in a book review published in the secular journal ISIS, which is readily available. The article is downloadable from the University of Chicago website. This is in the December 2007 issue, and let me read you a few excerpts here. I actually do have an electronic copy. On page 815 of that journal, of that issue, Michael Ruse says, so let it be clearly understood that I approached the God Delusion with no obvious hidden scientific or religious agenda. Remember, as I said, he was himself an atheist, or he is himself an atheist. I approached the God Delusion with no obvious hidden scientific or religious agenda, ready to belittle it no matter what. It is simply that it is not very good. For a start, Dawkins is brazen in his ignorance of philosophy and theology, not to mention the history of science. As I said, you don't have to be a theist, much less a Christian believer, to see that. So my points are twofold. First, that Michael Ruse did indeed have very scathing things to say about the reasoning used by Richard Dawkins. And second, that if you're going to discuss these matters, you need to adopt equitable standards of proof, a comparable standard of proof for your opponent and for yourself.